Clean it up now. Alessandro Romano's voice cut through the soft orchestral music of the ballroom like a serrated blade. He didn't just speak, he commanded, his face contorted into a smirk of pure, arrogant delight. With a flick of his wrist, he tipped his crystal flute, letting the vintage champagne pour slowly onto the polished marble floor, splashing against the hem of Valentina's simple black dress. The glass followed, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards that sent a sudden, chilling silence rippling through the gala. Feeling the eyes of Manhattan's elite upon him, Alessandro leaned forward, his luxury watch catching the light as he pointed an accusing, mocking finger inches from his mother's face. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet the new help," he announced, his voice booming with a cruel theatricality. "She looks familiar, doesn't she? That's because she's the woman who used to claim she raised me. Now, she's finally found a job suited to her talents, scrubbing floors and staying out of sight." Valentina stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat as she looked at the son she had once sacrificed everything for. Her gray hair was pulled back in a refined bun, and despite the wet fabric clinging to her ankles, she maintained a haunting elegance that Alessandro sought to destroy. He stepped closer, his fingers digging painfully into her shoulder to keep her from turning away. "Don't look so shocked, Valentina. You were always a burden, a ghost from a past I've outgrown. I should have left you in that rent-controlled apartment to rot years ago." The crowd erupted into tittering laughter, fueled by the champagne and the predatory thrill of witnessing a public execution of dignity. Alessandro's associates joined in, mocking the woman who had once been the quiet pillar of the Romano name. But as the laughter reached its peak, Alessandro failed to notice the sudden, violent shift in the room's temperature. He didn't see the way the seasoned billionaires in the back suddenly lowered their glasses, their faces draining of all color. He didn't hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of handmade Italian leather shoes approaching from the shadows. He didn't notice the two massive men in charcoal suits moving with military precision through the parting crowd, their hands resting ominously near their waistbands. Most importantly, he didn't see the man leading them, Vincenzo Cassano, the undisputed shadow king of the city, a man whose name was whispered only in prayers or death warrants. Alessandro was about to learn a lesson that no amount of money could buy. The woman he had just branded a maid, the mother he had discarded like trash, was no longer a defenseless Romano. She was a Cassano now, and the wolf who had adopted her into his pack had just walked into the room to claim his prize. Silence wasn't a sign of Valentina's defeat, it was the quiet before the total annihilation of Alessandro's world. "Now, let me take you back to the day the blood dried and the real war began. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless." The transition from mother to servant hadn't happened overnight, it was a slow, agonizing erosion fueled by Alessandro's rising ambition. 3 years ago, the Romano household was filled with the scent of Valentina's cooking and the shared dreams of a son climbing the corporate ladder. Valentina had spent decades scrubbing floors and working double shifts at a local diner just to put Alessandro through the best schools, believing his success would be their shared victory. But as his bank account grew, his memory of her sacrifice began to rot. It started with subtle remarks about her simple clothes and her old-fashioned ways, which he claimed embarrassed him in front of his new, high-society friends. The betrayal reached its peak on the rainy Tuesday when Alessandro returned home with a group of lawyers instead of his usual briefcase. He didn't look her in the eye as he tossed a stack of legal documents onto the kitchen table she had kept polished for 20 years. He told her the house was now a liability to his public image, that he needed a modern space to host the elite, and a graying mother in the background didn't fit the brand of a self-made titan. When she pleaded, reminding him of the nights she went hungry so he could have textbooks, he simply checked his watch. He gave her 1 hour to pack her life into 2 suitcases, claiming he had already arranged for a living allowance that was barely enough to cover a gutter-side apartment. As she stood on the sidewalk, clutching her bags while the locks were changed, Alessandro watched from the window with a look of bored detachment. He had already scrubbed her from his social media and his life, telling the world he was an orphan of greatness who had risen from nothing. He didn't just take her home, he took her identity, maxing out her credit cards to fund his first gala and then telling the courts she was mentally unstable and financially dependent when she tried to protest. He wanted her small so he could feel tall. He wanted her invisible so his lies could shine. Valentina had left that day with nothing but her dignity and a burning memory of the coldness in her son's eyes, a coldness she would remember every single day for the next 3 years as she waited for the world to show him that blood may be thick, but betrayal is a debt that always comes due with interest. Valentina's descent into the shadows of the city would have been her end if not for a chance encounter on a freezing November night. She was working a late-night shift at a secluded diner on the edge of the shipping district, her hands trembling as she wiped down a counter for the 1000th time. She had become a shadow, a woman who stayed neutral, eyes lowered, and hands steady to survive the daily humiliations of her new life. It was there that Vincenzo Cassano first saw her. He had entered the diner seeking a moment of quiet away from the violent complexities of his empire, but his eyes, sharp as a predator's, immediately locked onto the woman with the refined posture and the hollow, betrayed expression. He didn't see a waitress, he saw a person of high contrast status who had suffered a devastating fall from grace. When a rowdy customer tried to lay hands on her, Valentina didn't scream, she simply stood her ground with a quiet, lethal dignity that stopped the man in his tracks. Vincenzo, known as the Wolf of the City, moved with the confidence of someone never denied and intervened not out of pity, but out of a sudden, rare respect. He learned her story over a cup of bitter coffee, how her own blood had branded her worthless and left her in the gutter. To Vincenzo, who valued loyalty above all else, Alessandro's betrayal was the ultimate sin. He saw in Valentina a woman who had been destroyed and made to feel invisible by a man who used her for 3 years of lies before walking away. Vincenzo didn't offer her charity, he offered her a throne. He told her that silence isn't weakness, but strategy, and that he needed someone with her resilience to help manage the quiet corners of his world. He legally adopted her into the Cassano line, giving her a name that commanded fear and a seat at a table where her voice carried the weight of an empire. He taught her that revenge required time and that the best victory starts by letting your enemy underestimate you. While Alessandro was busy playing at being a titan, Valentina was reborn in the Cassano estate, surrounded by people who finally saw her value. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the mother of the mafia, a woman who had spent 5 years preparing to show her biological son exactly what happens when you humiliate a Cassano in public. The heavy silence that followed Alessandro's cruel laughter wasn't broken by a plea for mercy, but by the rhythmic, deliberate click of polished shoes against the marble floor. The crowd, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that Alessandro was too intoxicated by his own ego to notice, began to part like a retreating tide. From the velvet shadows of the perimeter, Vincenzo Cassano emerged. He moved with a predatory grace that made the air in the ballroom feel suddenly thin, his presence commanding a terrifying stillness that silenced even the most arrogant whispers. He didn't look at the glittering chandeliers or the socialites, his ice-cold gaze was locked entirely on the woman standing in a puddle of spilled champagne. Alessandro, oblivious to the identity of the man approaching, straightened his suit and prepared to deliver another jab. "See? Even the guests are coming over to watch you crawl, mother," he sneered, his finger still pointed accusingly. But the sneer died on his lips as Vincenzo stepped into the light. The color drained from Alessandro's face, his hand trembling as he slowly lowered his finger. He recognized the charcoal tuxedo, the obsidian eyes, and the sheer, lethal weight of the man who stood before him. Vincenzo didn't offer Alessandro a glance, he didn't acknowledge the existence of the man who had just desecrated his own blood. Instead, the mafia boss stopped inches from Valentina. The two men in dark suits who followed him stood like monoliths, their blank faces promising violence to anyone who dared move. In a gesture that sent a physical shockwave through the room, Vincenzo reached down and took Valentina's hand, the same hand Alessandro had just called the help, and raised it with profound, silent reverence. He bowed his head slightly, his lips grazing her knuckles in a gesture of absolute loyalty and protection. The room went cold. It was a declaration of war signed in a kiss. When Vincenzo finally looked up, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Madre," he whispered, the title landing like a gavel. He then turned his eyes toward Alessandro, and for the first time in his life, the young Romano understood the true meaning of fear. Vincenzo didn't need to shout to strip Alessandro of his power. The simple act of honoring the woman the son had sought to humiliate had shifted the world on its axis. Valentina stood tall, the gray in her hair shining like silver armor, as her adopted son stood by her side, ready to tear down the empire built on her tears. The shift in the room was palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Alessandro's chest as he watched the most dangerous man in the city treat his maid like royalty. Vincenzo didn't just stand by Valentina, he stood behind her, a silent shadow of impending doom. Valentina stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble, no longer the trembling woman who had been splashed with champagne. She reached into a small, elegant clutch she had been holding, not a server's tray, but a vessel for the truth. She pulled out a sleek, encrypted tablet and handed it to Vincenzo, but her eyes remained fixed on her biological son. "You always thought I was invisible, Alessandro," she said, her voice steady and echoing in the silent hall. "When you lived in that house, when you hosted those secret meetings with your crooked partners, you thought I was just the woman in the kitchen. You thought I was too old, too simple to understand the numbers you were crunching or the contracts you were signing." A cold smirk played on her lips as she watched Alessandro's eyes dart toward the tablet. "But mothers see everything. I didn't just leave with 2 suitcases that rainy night 3 years ago. I left with the digital keys to every backdoor account you used to hide your embezzlement from the board of directors. I stayed in the Cassano estate not just to hide, but to work. While you were buying luxury watches and pretending to be a self-made titan, I was meticulously tracing the breadcrumbs of your greed." Vincenzo tapped the screen, and the large projectors behind the gala stage, intended to show Alessandro's corporate achievements, suddenly flickered to life. Instead of promotional videos, they displayed a dizzying audit of shell companies, offshore accounts, and forged signatures. The gasps from the crowd were sharp. Valentina had brought more than just the mafia's protection, she had brought the evidence of a 5-year criminal conspiracy. "You built your throne on stolen money, Alessandro," Valentina continued, her elegance now sharpened into a weapon. "And you used my sweat and my name to grease the wheels. I was never your help. I was the architect of your downfall." Alessandro's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he realized that the woman he had tried to bury had been the one holding the shovel all along. He had underestimated her heart, but his fatal mistake was underestimating her mind. The audit of his arrogance had begun, and the debt was about to be collected in full. The digital evidence on the screens cast a cold, blue glow over the ballroom, turning the gala into a courtroom. Alessandro's breath came in ragged hitches as he felt the social floor beneath him begin to liquefy. He tried to hide his trembling hands, but Valentina's eyes were like lasers, focusing on the glint of gold and sapphire at his cuff. She stepped closer, the crowd parting for her as if she were the one wearing the crown. With a movement as swift as a strike, she grabbed his wrist and held it aloft for the guests to see. "Look at this watch," Valentina commanded, her voice ringing with a terrifying clarity. Alessandro told the press it was a gift to himself for a record-breaking fiscal year. He wears it as a symbol of his hard-earned dominance. She turned her gaze to the board members and investors standing in the front row, their faces twisted in growing realization. "But if you look at the serial number registered in the Cassano database, you'll find it was purchased on the 14th of last month, the same day the Romano Group's employee pension fund was restructured due to a supposed market dip." A collective gasp, sharper and more jagged than the broken glass on the floor, erupted from the room. The luxury watch, once a badge of honor, suddenly looked like a shackle. "You didn't just steal from your company, Alessandro. You stole from the janitors who worked late shifts like I did. You stole from the retirees who trusted your name because they thought you were a man of integrity." She let go of his arm with a look of pure disgust, as if his skin were toxic. "You called me a maid to hide the fact that you are a common thief." Alessandro's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The Wolf of Manhattan associates he had spent years trying to impress began to back away, forming a circle of isolation around him. Vincenzo stood just a step behind Valentina, his silent presence ensuring that no one, not even Alessandro's personal security, dared to intervene. The public unmasking was complete. In the span of a few minutes, the man who had tried to strip his mother of her dignity had been stripped of his own. He wasn't a titan of industry, he was a fraud caught in the glare of the truth he had tried to bury. Valentina stood tall, the weight of her 3 years of suffering finally lifting, replaced by the cold, hard satisfaction of justice delivered in the presence of those he feared most. The digital screens continued to bleed Alessandro's secrets into the room, but the true devastation was happening in the silence of the pockets. As the socialites watched the financial data with voyeuristic horror, the phones of the city's most powerful men began to vibrate in unison. It was a synchronized strike, a phantom army moving through the cellular networks. Alessandro's primary investors, men who had just been laughing at his cruel jokes moments ago, pulled their devices from their silk pockets, their faces turning from amusement to ash. Vincenzo hadn't just brought Valentina to a party, he had brought the full weight of the Cassano influence to bear on a house of cards. One by one, the titans of industry looked from their screens to Vincenzo, then to the sweating, trembling Alessandro. The messages were brief but unmistakable. The Cassano family was withdrawing its protective interest from any entity associated with the Romano Group. In the brutal mathematics of the underworld and the high-stakes boardroom, this was a death sentence. Without that backing, insurance rates would triple, shipping lanes would close, and credit lines would freeze by morning. My merger," Alessandro stammered, his phone suddenly ringing with a frantic call from his CFO. He didn't answer it. He didn't have to. Across the room, the CEO of the conglomerate he was supposed to merge with tomorrow morning simply turned his back, ostentatiously deleting Alessandro's contact info. The calls from the Cassanos weren't just threats, they were a restructuring of reality. Alessandro watched in real time as his multi-million-dollar deals vanished into the ether. A massive infrastructure contract in the East River? Cancelled. The acquisition of the textile mills? Defaulted. Valentina watched him crumble, her expression one of calm, detached observation. She had spent years watching him build this empire on the broken backs of others, and now she was watching the wind blow it all away. "A name is only as strong as the people who stand behind it, Alessandro," she said softly, though her voice carried through the hollowed-out room. "You thought you stood alone at the top, but you were only standing on the grace I gave you and the fear Vincenzo commands. Now, you have neither." By the time the next song on the gala's playlist began to filter through the speakers, The Romano Empire wasn't just falling, it was gone, leaving nothing behind but a bitter young man standing in a puddle of spilled champagne. The aftermath of the gala was a swift and merciless erasure. Within 48 hours, the locks on Alessandro's penthouse had been changed, his luxury vehicle seized by creditors, and his name dragged through the mud of every financial tabloid in the country. The man who had once pointed a finger in mockery now found himself standing in the rain outside the iron gates of the Cassano estate, his tailored suit soaked and his ego shattered. He looked small, the luxury watch gone from his wrist, replaced by the pale, bare skin of a man who had lost his identity along with his assets. When the gates finally groaned open, it wasn't Vincenzo who met him, but Valentina. She stood under a black silk umbrella held by a silent guard, her expression unreadable. Alessandro threw himself toward her, falling to his knees in the mud, the same way he had expected her to crawl for the champagne glass. "Mom, please," he sobbed, the words sounding foreign and clunky after years of disuse. "They took everything. I have nowhere to go. You're my mother, you can't let them do this to me. Tell Vincenzo to stop. Tell him I'm sorry." He reached out to grab the hem of her coat, his eyes searching hers for the soft, flickering light of the woman who used to stay up late worrying about his fever. He was betting everything on the one thing he had spent years trying to destroy, her motherly love. He thought he could still manipulate the heart he had trampled on, believing that a mother's devotion was a weakness he could exploit one last time to regain his throne. "I was confused, Mom. The pressure of the business, it changed me. But I'm still your son. Your little boy. You have to save me." Valentina looked down at him, but she didn't see her little boy. She saw the man who had called her the help in front of the world. She saw the thief who had stolen the pensions of honest workers. Most of all, she saw a predator who only became a victim when he ran out of prey. She didn't pull away, but she didn't reach down to lift him up either. "You aren't a little boy, Alessandro," she said, her voice like a cool breeze over a graveyard. "You are a man who made a choice. You chose status over blood, and greed over honor. You didn't come here because you love me. You came here because you ran out of people to use." She watched a single tear track through the dirt on his face, unmoved. The manipulation that had worked for decades finally hit a wall of cold, hard reality. The mother he thought he could control had died the night he threw her into the street. The woman standing before him now was a Cassano, and she knew exactly what his pleas were worth. Valentina stood unmoved as the rain continued to lash against the iron gates, the rhythmic tapping on her umbrella the only sound in the heavy silence. Alessandro remained on his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the maternal warmth he had so callously extinguished years ago. He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed, searching for the soft woman who used to bandage his knees and whisper that everything would be all right. But that woman had been buried under the weight of his own cruelty. "I can't believe you're doing this," Alessandro choked out, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're a mother. You're supposed to forgive. That's what a mother's love is, it's unconditional. If you don't bail me out, if you don't tell Vincenzo to drop the charges, I'll go to prison for decades. They'll destroy me." Valentina leaned forward slightly, her shadow falling over him like a shroud. "You are half right, Alessandro," she said, her voice a calm, chilling anchor in the storm. "A mother's love is indeed a powerful thing. It was that love that worked 3 jobs to pay for your tuition. It was that love that stayed silent while you humiliated me, hoping you would find your way back to the man I raised. But you confuse love with permission. You think that because I am your mother, I am required to be your accomplice." She took a step closer, the tip of her umbrella nearly touching his chest. "There is a difference between a mother's love and a mother's duty. My duty now is to provide the one thing I failed to give you when you were younger, consequences. If I save you now, I am only teaching you that you can destroy lives and crawl back to safety. I would be failing you as a parent if I let you walk away from the wreckage you created. Alessandro let out a jagged, hollow laugh. So this is your justice? Watching your own son rot in a cell? No, Valentina replied, her gaze as sharp as a diamond. My justice was reclaiming my name. Your imprisonment is simply the natural result of your own choices. I am not sending you to prison, Alessandro, your greed already built the walls. I am simply refusing to be the one to break them down. She turned her back on him, signaling the guard to close the gates. As the heavy iron bars slid shut with a definitive, metallic clang, Valentina didn't look back. She walked toward the lights of the Cassano estate, leaving the boy she had once loved to face the man he had become, alone in the dark. The seasons turned, and the scandal that had once rocked the foundations of the city's elite faded into a cautionary tale whispered in the corners of high society clubs. 1 year later, the name Romano no longer commanded fear or envy, it commanded respect only when associated with the woman who had reclaimed it. Valentina sat at a wide mahogany desk in a sun-drenched office overlooking the skyline, the logo of the Romano Cassano Foundation etched in frosted glass behind her. She was no longer the shadow in the kitchen or the maid at the gala. She was the architect of a new legacy, one built on the restoration of the lives her son had tried to dismantle. As the head of the foundation, Valentina spent her days overseeing the redistribution of the assets recovered from Alessandro's fall. She didn't use the money for silk dresses or luxury watches, she channeled it into pension recovery funds for the workers he had robbed and housing for women who, like her, had been discarded by the men they helped build. Beside her, Vincenzo Cassano remained a constant, silent partner, not as a master, but as a son who understood that true power was found in the protection of the vulnerable. Their bond, forged in the fires of a public betrayal, had become the strongest currency in the city. Across the city, in a starkly different reality, a man in a faded, grease-stained uniform moved through the corridors of a massive shipping warehouse. Alessandro's hands, once soft and accustomed to the weight of luxury gold, were now calloused and scarred. He didn't have a corner office or a title, he had a court-mandated debt schedule and a broom. Part of his sentence for the pension fraud involved community restitution, working the very entry-level jobs he had once mocked. Every paycheck he earned was garnished before he even touched it, sent directly to the foundation his mother now led. One evening, as Alessandro finished his shift, he caught a glimpse of a news segment on a nearby monitor. There was Valentina, looking radiant and powerful, standing with the family she had saved. For a moment, he reached out as if to touch the screen, but he stopped. He finally understood that he hadn't just lost his money or his status, he had lost the only person who would have loved him for free. Valentina had won, not by seeking his blood, but by letting him live in the world he had created for others. As she walked out of the office and into the golden light of her new reign, she didn't look back at the past. She had found the ultimate victory, the freedom to be herself, and the peace of knowing that justice had finally come home. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.